welcome back to my channel. It's Caroline. Today I'm going to be reviewing episode 3 of season 5 of Netflix's The Crown. And yes, I've done a video where I combined reviewing episodes 1 and 2, but episode 3, I just had to give it a video all to itself because I feel like it's a bit of a jewel in the season 5 crown. And I'm sure like other people have different takes on this, but the reason I call it a jewel is because it doesn't focus so heavily on the monarchy, but more about how they are perceived. And it also gave the spotlight on different actors to deliver, and I really like that. Episode 3 is called Mou Mou, and when you see that first, you're a bit confused and you're dropped into 1946 Egypt. And unless you know the story of the Al Fayeds, Mohammed and his son Dodi, you're going to be confused as a Crown viewer as to what on earth you're doing in 1946 Egypt, watching a local football match between the Egyptians and the English soldiers that are stationed there. But regardless, I love the way they created Egypt. I love the insights they gave. I mean, you looked at the football match and it was so unfair. The English were pulling fouls, they were doing everything, but they were being completely overlooked. And it set up the scene that society in Egypt is really controlled by the British. The Egyptians don't really have much choice. They're not going to be treated fairly, and the English are always going to have the upper hand. And I like the way the episode opened with a clear physical demonstration of this via a local football match. And you have a young Mohammed Al Fayed who is playing on the pitch and he is fouled and he's going, "Hey ref," and no, the English are just led away with it, and it just sets up how he has been brought up that to be English is to be something better. It speaks to so many different aspects and the negative aspects of the British Empire that isn't always made clear, that many countries are not happy with the way they were taken over by the British Empire. And I really like that this episode puts a spotlight on that. I also think this is a great episode to watch if your partner, your other half, isn't a big monarchist, isn't a royalist, doesn't really like seeing the royal family, because this is more of a societal view of the impact of the monarchy and British rule and empire rule has had on a wider scale. Another thing I really like about this episode is that you see some former The Crown cast members in the form of Alex Jennings and Leah Williams, who are playing the abdicated King Edward and Wallace Simpson. You see them considering a young Sydney who turns out to be really pivotal in this episode, and them giving him a chance and asking him to be a permanent member, a permanent valet to Edward, and young Sydney completely takes him up on the opportunity. So you don't know the significance of Mou Mou Mohammed. You don't even know where Mou Mou is coming first. You see after the football match, you see Mohammed selling Coca-Colas and him being intrigued by this beautiful Egyptian girl, and next to her brother, who's a bit up himself, you can tell. But Mou Mou Mohammed, being the businessman and the future businessman he is, they strike a deal, him and the brother of the girl he is admiring. It seems to foretell Mohammed's future business success, and it sort of gives him his first chance to really make a good deal. Fast forward, you see him, he's marrying the girl of his dreams, it looks like, and he has a baby, and then the baby is named Dodi. And I think for a lot of people then that's when everything clocked. This is the future rumored fiance of Diana, who will ultimately die with Diana in the crash in Paris and Pont d'Alma. Fast forward, then you're dropped in the mid-70s, and the Ritz in London, if you live in London, you'll know the Ritz is sort of like a staple. It does still look a bit run down, that's my own personal opinion, but anyway, you see the Ritz is in dire financial straits and in need of a rescuer, and that rescuer comes in the form of Mohammed. And you can see he's met with the same prejudice and racism that he was met with when he was trying to sell Coca-Cola back those years when he was on the pitch playing the English football players. And the owner of the Ritz is really questioning the legitimacy of where the funding is coming from, but Mohammed, being the exquisite salesman that he is and businessman, ultimately gets to buy the Ritz, convinces the owner of the Ritz otherwise, and then you fast forward and you see the party for the celebration for the purchase of the Ritz. And you also see an older Sydney serving at the Ritz. And then you see something which was really, really stark, and it's sort of with the theme that discrimination and racism breeds racism. And you see Mohammed, because Sydney is black, wanting him to be instructed to leave, to not be there. And despite what Mohammed has been through, despite the prejudice, despite everything he's been through, he sees a black person and wants that person gone because of the impression it could make. And that is just so upsetting on many levels for so many people watching this. But it's interesting because Dodi, he acquiesced to his father's request and asked Sydney to leave, but finds out enough about Sydney to know that he was valet to Edward. And this intrigues Mohammed because this man has lived with royalty, and this episode shows the impact of the monarchy on other nations and how they are perceived, that if you are close to the monarchy, you are someone. The closer you are, the more important you are, the more seriously you are taken. It's like your route to success. And so here he sees somebody who has been valet to a former king of England, and he absolutely jumps at the chance to get Sydney to hire him, to have Sydney show him how to be the English gentleman. And I love the scenes where Sydney is teaching Mou Mou how to be a British gentleman. You had Salim Dole. It's such a good portrayal of Mohammed Al Fayed and Mou Mou. Like, this guy has been through a lot, but then this guy also is guilty of racism and prejudice. But then he almost sees the error in his ways by misjudging Sydney. So I think it's a very complex character to play. It's a very complex relationship that Mou Mou navigates in the world, where he is clearly a fantastic success and just wants to be close to the monarchy. And it's a sort of sadistic love that plays out, and I just feel like Salim Daw did such a good job of that. Sydney is played by Jude Aduwadiki. You see that he really loved Edward and Wallace Simpson. And a lot of people could say, oh, you know, why would he want to serve the monarchy? Why? But you can tell he loved every second of it. And because it was upliftment for him in terms of, I'm sure, his financial situation and pride for the family. But he sees the prejudice and he sees the negatives of the monarchy as well, because he lived it with Edward. And you see the love that he has for Edward, and the value of what being an English gentleman can give to someone in society, but then also the ugly side of the monarchy. And I feel like that was not an easy thing to portray, but Jude does a really, really good job of doing this. We then jump to the races in London, and Mou Mou finally has kind of what he wants in his grasp. He's paid so much for these tickets to enter, and still on the way in, subject to racism, discrimination, and Sydney as well. It's just so disgusting. He paid so much for these tickets, and yet he was still number of rows away from the Queen. And this is where he asks who's sitting next to the Queen, and how do you get to sit next to the Queen at this event? And you're swiftly informed that it's the owner of Harrods, and it's a privilege reserved for the owner of Harrods. Mou Mou wants to buy Harrods, and he can do it. He picks out a huge sum. I think it's like 600 million. And it's like, yeah, right, I want to buy Harrods. Then you have Dodi, and then Dodi is played by Khalid Abdallah. I think he's a really good likeness for Dodi. You have this son who is clearly privileged financially, but disadvantaged by way of his heritage, unfortunately, and the way they're considered in English society. And he wants to pursue his own agenda and create his own lasting legacy, and wants to do it via films. And he is seeking the funding from his father, but the father wants to use the funding to buy Harrods. So it's the first time you see a conflict, and you see Dodi under a spotlight. And he stands up to his father and he says, well, you want me to stand on my own 2 feet, but you need to give me the financial support to do this. So yeah, I get Mou Mou's point that, well, hang on, this is the fortune that I raised and I want to use it for my endeavors, and you have good connections now because of me, and is that not enough? But anyway, Dodi manages to get the funding from his father and puts the money into a film, which later we know to be Chariots of Fire. And it's interesting to see When the film is being shot on a beach, or part of it being shot on a beach, you see Mou Mou visiting, and you hear Dodie explaining that, oh, it's about overcomes discrimination and wins medals in the Olympics. And Egyptians at the time unfortunately did not hold Jewish individuals in the highest esteem. But when Dodie rephrases it as an outsider becoming an insider, that immediately resonates with Mou Mou. And that's so true of life. It is perspective, and it is the way you phrase things and look at things, and there's so much unconscious bias and discrimination. And this episode is why I really like this episode. It just shows you it in such clear, I don't want to say black and white, but it does. You then fast forward to the Oscars and Chariots of Fire winning the Oscar, but you see that even though Mou Mou and Dodie have financed this, they're not there. They're not at the Oscars. They're not at any parties. They haven't been invited anywhere, even though they're specifically mentioned in the Oscar acceptance speech as them putting the money where the director's mouth were and the producer's mouth were. It's maddening. And the only person that Mou Mou has to celebrate with is Sydney. We also understand that the Harrods purchase has gone through. He's celebrating, and he says to Sydney, well, like, why are you not celebrating? You know, why are you not delighted? This is a huge, huge step. All your work that you've put into me, and now I can finally be the British gentleman. But Sydney is distraught because of the passing of Wallace Simpson, and also the degenerative state that she has been in for years, being fed through a tube. You see then the loving side of Mou Mou, who wants to comfort Sydney, and they visit in France the house where there was so much love, where former King Edward and Wallace Simpson lived, and it has been let go to rack and ruin. And Mou Mou can't understand how the royal family have just left all this stuff, all this royal paraphernalia there. Sydney explains that, well, it's all now under the property of the French government, and all the items, including some very personal crown items, they're going to be auctioned off. Mou Mou, being the astute businessman he is, spies an opportunity to potentially get closer to the royal family, because being close to the royal family means you are someone, means you are taken seriously. Sort of, it goes back to that sadistic, sycophantic, and I don't mean that in, well, nature of wanting to just be accepted. That goes back, you see it in the initial conversation with the father that Mou Mou has with his father at the time, and still all these years later that desire is as strong as ever, and he purchases the whole property and all of its contents. And then the royal family have to pay attention, because there are some very personal items, and particularly the diaries of Edward around the time of the abdication, and also the fact that he used to hang out with Nazis, basically. Then jump to the Queen, and she has to pay attention, but she does not want to go. And you see Prince Philip saying, don't you dare go. You see Mou Mou being told that, oh, you're going to get a visit from the Queen. He's so excited. The royal party looks to be arriving, and it's not the Queen, it's her secretary there to just take all the items away. And you can see this is visibly upsetting. And you see Sydney just being distraught by all these lovely items being taken away back to the institution that harmed his beloved master so much. And when all these items are taken away, Sydney says to Mou Mou, like, this feeling that you've had, I've had it for years. But again, you see, it's like the abused partner in a relationship. Mou Mou is just delighted that he's been able to please the Queen. That's all he wants. And you sort of you see Sydney just like not understanding his viewpoint whatsoever. And it's, oh my God, it's so ringing true for people who have just blinkers on and cannot see. And then you jump and you see that Sydney is becoming gravely ill, and instead of Sydney being the valet to Mou Mou, the roles switch, and Mou Mou dutifully cares for Sydney in his final days. And I thought it's just really, really touching. Mou Mou arranges the burial of Sydney, and on his tombstone states valet to the king, and it is an honor bestowed upon Sydney. And honestly, like, there's so much kindness that comes from Mou Mou, and it's crazy considering there was an initial act of extreme discrimination and racism could have flipped into such kindness. And it just shows the complexity that is in this world today in relation to this topic. It was a really nice tribute that Mou Mou did for Sydney, and Sydney had made Mou Mou the British gentleman he always wanted to be. You then see, now as the owner of Harrods, Mou Mou is expecting to be sitting next to the Queen at that annual racing event. And when he gets there, racism and discrimination comes through again, and the Queen, who sees Margaret there, does not want to sit with him. You see, in the end, it's Diana. And you know when Diana sits down that this is the beginning of her road to her death, which is crazy. And you see Dodie being introduced to Diana, you see the interest that Dodie has in Diana, and Diana and Mou Mou, they do strike up a friendship, a playful joviality, all bonding over their shared exclusion by the Queen. You see the Queen and Margaret looking on at how well Diana and Mou Mou are getting along, and Margaret says, out of the acorn of a simple kindness, a big oak tree can grow. An oak tree of happiness can grow. And it's true, because Dodie seemed to make Diana so happy, but it's a double-edged sword, because this happiness and this love will ultimately lead her to her death. So this episode, it's why there's just a lot going on here, and I loved the mature depiction of racism and discrimination in society, the abused partner in the way of Mou Mou and his obsession to be close to the royals, and that he didn't mind. All he wanted to do was please, and any attention whatsoever was met with huge gratitude. And there's so much of that in society. You had a depiction of the Empire and the various conflicting views in the Commonwealth and in Egypt. It's very complex, and there's the history that has been left there. It's not simple, and I think that's what this episode shows really well, is the complexity that surrounds having a monarchy, having an empire, the negative traits. It's an episode about an underdog getting hugely successful, but then it also shows that why is it so hard? This individual, he does everything on the box and is still discriminated against because of his background and his color. And then you have the introduction of Dodie and Diana, which is just sparking alarm bells, because you know what's going to happen. So I loved this episode. I'd be very interested to know your views. I'm sure some people maybe didn't like this episode because it didn't focus enough on the main primary characters of the season, but for me, I really liked that approach. I really liked that it gave a spotlight to something else, because the monarchy, it's not just about the family, it's about the wider impact. Thank you for watching. Tune back in for my next review. Take care, subscribe, and enable notifications.